Welcome to the Wordy Pair Podcast, your go-to hub for all things writing, world building, and the occasional dive into the weird and wonderful world of fiction. We're breaking down the barriers between you and your next great story. Whether you're a seasoned scribe or just scribbling your first sentences, we've got something for you. We'll be discussing everything from crafting compelling characters to dissecting the good, the bad, and the downright bizarre in the world of fiction. Okay, this script says you guys are eccentric. Isn't that just a 3-syllable word for weird? No offense. So, whether you're in need of inspiration, a good laugh, or just a couple of weirdos to keep you company on your writing journey, you're in the right place. Thanks for tuning in to the Wordy Pair Podcast.
Hello and welcome everybody. This is the Wordy Pair Podcast, and as always, I'm Rudy.
And as sometimes I'm Justin.
As usually.
At best.
At best. And today we're going to be talking about a particular book that we both read last week, and it's called The Sinister Shadow. It is a crossover book between Doc Savage and The Shadow. And this is actually my first Doc Savage book. It might be my second or third Shadow book. You have extensive experience reading Shadow books. Is that right?
No, actually it's not. I've read a couple of them, but there's most of what I know is the radio show.
Oh,
so
okay.
This was actually
I've heard some of that too, so yeah.
Yeah, I think this is one of the first books that I actually read, and I mean, I don't know how good of a jumping off point it is for The Shadow, because it's well, for starters, actually I have it right here. I'm going to have a look real quick. I don't remember if it was I don't think it was written by the original creator of The Shadow.
No, it was written by the guy doing Doc Savage.
Yeah. This particular book is one of the first ones that I actually read. My evolution of being into The Shadow was listening to the radio show, and then the movie coming out in 1994, which me and my brother both loved, to the point that my brother actually constructed a Halloween costume as The Shadow.
He constructed a Halloween costume of The Shadow? Or he acted as The Shadow while constructing a Halloween costume of something unrelated?
That would also have been funny, but that's more like something I would do, not something he would do.
So this book was written by Will Murray and Lester Dent, writing as Kenneth Robeson for some reason.
This was... I forget exactly what the reasoning was, but I remember the original writer for The Shadow was...
Yeah, well, the original writer for... Yeah, was it The Shadow or was it Doc Savage?
I believe it was The Shadow. The original writer wanted to have a pen name so that if other people had to write stories and he needed time off, or if he was going to retire at some point, people could just pick up the same name and pretend that it was always being written by the same person.
Right. Okay, so let's see. About the author, Lester Dent. He was the young Oklahoma pulp writer who relocated to New York City in February 1932. He wrote... Yeah, he was the first one to start writing the Doc Savage books. He penned the story The Golden Vulture, which was a crossover between Doc Savage and The Shadow, but it wasn't published while he was still around. Or no, wait. Golden Vulture, over the next 16 years, Lester went on to write over 150 Doc Savage novels, good gravy, but he never again penned a story featuring The Shadow. The Golden Vulture was filed away, resurfacing in 1938, when series originator Walter B. Gibson was given the manuscript to revise for publication. With The Sinister Shadow, it was constructed from the unused chapters and leftover scenes of the early drafts of that manuscript. Lester Dent now has a second Shadow novel to his credit, over 80 years after he drafted his first, and a half-century after his untimely death in 1959. Will Murray completed the book in and around 2015, which is when the book is actually copyrighted. So this is something that is probably more common than most people realize, especially in the pulps. That like books get shelved and put away, and someone else picks them up, or someone else looks at it and says, "I want to turn this into something else much later." Like I just finished reading Triplanetary by E. Doc Smith, and it has the same, it only has one author, thankfully, but even that one author wrote parts of that book widely separated in time. So, when you're writing a huge number of novels, it's actually not that big of a deal to throw one away for the time being and say, oh, well, we'll look at that later.
Yeah, this happened a lot with a lot of the pulps, where it was just like, oh, we found something else that never got written, and so they try to piecemeal together a story. In the case of this book, it was kind of hard to find, I say hard, but it was harder to just find the Shadow novels without listening to audiobooks on, say, YouTube or something, or you had to dig up on eBay to find old copies of things, or you had to go to certain comic conventions. People would be selling old pulp novels. I haven't actually seen that in a while, so that might not be a thing much anymore. But a good 10 to 15 years ago, it was pretty common to see a bunch of Doc Savage sitting at a corner booth on a comic convention.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the books in general were usually printed, paperback only, usually fairly low quality printing. The books themselves were not designed, for the most part, because there were so many of them. They were not designed for the most part to, live for a very long time. And so you end up with this problem where as the stuff stays under copyright but gets older and older, it becomes incredibly hard to find actual hard copies. And of course, electronic copies are few and far between because number one, nobody thinks they can make money off of them, and nobody who would be willing to pay a license fee is willing to try to make money off of them either. Once these books go out of copyright, or once parts of the manuscripts go out of copyright, then people can without having to spend absurd licensing fees, pick up one of these manuscripts and throw it out into the ether and see whether people want it or not. So it's much easier to do that electronically these days.
Yeah, and there's a lot of examples that, some of it becomes a danger of becoming lost media.
Yeah.
And or it just gets increasingly hard to find as time goes on. I remember
once if it goes out of copyright, while someone still has a copy of it, usually they'll say, "Oh, this is out of copyright. I'm going to digitize this." But there are plenty of books probably that went out of copyright where nobody who cared still owned a copy of it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a series I've actually been wanting to read called The Destroyer, and it's the character in The Destroyer was Remo Williams, who had a movie back in I think the late 80s or early 90s.
Fred Ward played Remo Williams.
Yeah, and that was based off of the character from the Destroyer novels. There were 100 of these novels.
Oh wow.
And it was kind of another pulpy fiction-y thing, but I think it was more like 60s than 40s or 50s. It was sometime
okay, so
around.
A little bit more modern, yeah.
Yeah. And those are hard enough to find on their own. I've never actually looked for them on eBay because there's probably someone that's selling a whole box of them on eBay, I'm sure. So it's probably not too hard to find them. But I've always liked going out into the wild and seeing if I could find a couple of copies. And to date, I have only ever seen a copy of any of the Destroyer novels in the wild once in my entire life.
Wow.
I've never seen it again either. The time that I did see them was before I had seen that movie and had an interest in them.
Oh, so you remember seeing the copy of it before you saw the movie?
Yeah, it was at one of the comic conventions where a guy was selling a bunch of Doc Savage and the Destroyer.
Oh, okay.
So this particular book is interesting because it came out in 2015. Now,
right.
I don't remember exactly the year that Dawn of Justice came out, but it had to have been right around there. Let me actually look that up real quick. Dawn of Justice movie, parentheses, sucks.
It sure does.
So let's see. Batman vs. Superman, Dawn of Justice, 2016. Okay, so this book was published, written a long time ago for the most part, but published in 2015, 1 year before the movie that was supposed to pit Batman and Superman against each other was due to come out. I don't think that was entirely an accident, because people knew that movie was coming at least a year previous.
Sure.
And it would have been the proper time for that book to get released. I don't know why they didn't try to get more traction and advertise it a little bit, because it is essentially, or rather, it is the precursor to any sort of Batman versus Superman story.
Yeah.
Now you having read it, you're the only other person I know that's read this book. I read it back when that Batman versus Superman movie came out, and I was like, oh, that was exactly the thing. Like, I just stumbled across it, and I was like, wait, The Shadow versus Doc Savage? This is that movie that's coming out next year, only good.
Yeah.
And that's why I ended up reading it.
Well, like, did you read it electronically initially, or did you actually find a hard copy?
I read it electronically. I
Okay.
immediately downloaded it to my Kindle when I saw it, and I just read through it that night.
Oh.
And I loved every minute. It is so packed full of action and things going on. It's just one of them books where it's just like, there's no stop to events taking place, which aren't necessarily always what you want to read, but they're definitely good pastimes.
Yeah.
It's good escapism. So having gotten to the point where we've got, old characters resurfacing and having already done what they took years to have the new characters do, even though people were probably clamoring for it over and over again.
What, you mean Batman and Superman specifically?
Yeah, I mean
that was based off
obviously,
of a comic that came out
yeah,
dozens of years ago.
yeah, based off of is the proper way. Semi-based off of might be a little bit better, but we won't go there.
Well, those things are always a mishmash, so.
Yeah, I think there's a tendency when people turn these things into new media that they don't want to do exactly the same thing that it was famous for. Like, I remember watching, I think the third Thor movie, Thor Ragnarok, and it was basically like Planet Hulk, except it was a Thor movie. I don't know. It was a little bit different from what I had experienced from Planet Hulk. But then again, I'm not a big Marvel guy, so I don't know much about any of that stuff. I know a little bit more about Batman versus Superman.
Well, like,
But,
I mean, it's one of those things where I guess I misspoke, because several of these things are actually made to be, faithful recreations of the comic in animated or movie form. Like, there's an animated version of The Killing Joke. There's
yeah.
There's a bunch of animated. There's a bunch of pretty good DC animated movies that are, well, some of them are
I would say the
recreations
majority of
specific comic
them.
arcs.
The majority of them
But like
were
when they
very
do a
good.
movie, and when you have someone who claims to have artistic vision, like a Zack Snyder, he's never content to simply take something and adapt it. He has to take multiple things and mishmash them together and then ruin all the writing.
Yeah, because he has no imagination. Like, you can take
Correct.
something that's already done and do something with it that will garner more interest without changing very much. I mean, the whole point of it is, ooh, there's this thing that everyone loved. We're going to put real actors and real special effects down to make this into something that we can sit back and watch instead of read. It's not exactly something that requires a complete makeover. There's already a lot of work that'll go into it to begin with. You have the story there. You should run with the story, with, the exceptions of, especially, I mean, you and I were alive in the 80s and 90s. There were things that you just didn't want to try and spend the money on to make a movie out of something. The special
Right.
effects budget would get out of control.
Yeah.
I reckon it's not as big a problem today, but even computer special effects are expensive. I mean, they crank out
they
$300 million movies. That Dawn of Justice was what, $400 million or something?
I have no idea.
Me neither. I'm just guessing, pulling a number out of nowhere, but it had to have been around that. But this one book, it's kind of got a bit more oomph to it when pitting two characters against each other, because you're not dealing with a Batman who has a massive amount of resources at his disposal to try and come up with a way to fight a man who is, for all intents and purposes, a god. You're actually dealing with two mortal men, both who are so superhuman that to the rest of the world, they are almost as immortal. And in this case, they both have massive amounts of resources at their disposal. The Shadow through cunning and subterfuge, and Doc Savage, who is actually a good combination of the wealth of Bruce Wayne and the heroism of Superman.
Yeah.
So it's almost like this book is almost like the Shadow versus Superman and Batman, except Superman is a bit less immortal in this case.
Yeah, yeah.
but it's very interesting because they don't have like loose. The plot elements in the Batman versus Superman movie were a little bit loose, whereas in this book, there's a lot that's kind of like, oh, this is a little down to earth with all of the engineering discussion and the neat little tricks they talk about. I mean, they don't even really get into any of the Shadow having like any mental powers or anything in this book.
Right.
It's all just psychological messing with the villains.
I guess you could question whether the Shadow's ability to take on the appearance of other people very rapidly is not some kind of like psychological mind power, you know?
Yeah,
he does that a lot. So
there is a touch of these two men basically having superpowers. I mean, for one thing, like you said, the Shadow is very quick to be able to disguise himself in this book.
Well, but I mean, he's not even using makeup or carrying around the disguise. Like there's definitely something. There definitely seems to be the implication that there's something psychological about the way that he transforms into other people or into literally a shadow various times throughout the book.
Yeah, they kind of make it seem like he's almost some kind of creature instead of a human being, and it's in the way it's written, because the intention of those stories is usually to imply that the way that the Shadow is always dressed, he manages to appear as some kind of dark blob, and they kind of examine this when
there's a lot of cases in this book where he like takes on the appearance of a taxi driver or something like that.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, they don't necessarily explain where his costumes are coming from in these moments, which is about the only magic or superpower that technically appears in these stories. That's what I'm saying.
It might be like a psychological thing. Like,
yeah,
if he can convince, if he has mental powers over people, he could convince them that he looks like this particular other person, without actually needing to lug around the disguises. Is my point.
Yeah. And this was actually this was one of the things that kind of made the radio show what it was. There were a few marked differences between the radio show and the stories. In the stories, there was a lot less of the supernatural that made the Shadow. It was a lot more psychological. In the radio show, they straight up gave him psychic powers and said that he learned them from mystics of the Orient, and a lot of his enemies also had some of these strange abilities. But for the most part, the spirit of the show was the same as these books, with a bit more lighthearted note, because it was on radio where kids might be listening.
Yeah.
Even so, people would still meet grisly ends in a lot of the radio show programs. But
sure.
The Shadow is
the thing about the Shadow, right, is that he usually engineers a situation where a person orchestrates his own end unwittingly, and so that kind of has the effect of being like you get what you deserve kind of thing, which, is a message that is the kind of message that would get across over in radio, even to kids, and be, approved of in general.
Yeah, or at least it would have back then. I would hope that it still would today if people still listen to radio.
Right.
There's a lot going on with Doc Savage as well that kind of lends credence to the idea of him having superpowers, but for the most part, they explain it away very well just by saying that not only was he highly trained as a young man, and he had all these different disciplines that he learned, and he outpaced his teachers in all of them. I believe it was 5 disciplines total. He knew an expert lawyer, an expert engineer, what was the other guy? There's like 3 other guys. 2 of them don't really make a big appearance in this book.
No, they're out of town.
But yeah, he is a master of 5 trades, and he excels at them better than the people who taught him. And he trains himself in many, kind of like a Sherlock Holmes. He's almost like a Sherlock Holmes, where he does ritualistic practice of things every day to stay in top form for his detective and criminology ways.
Yeah. Well, he mentions, I think, being trained in ventriloquy as well. Like, none of his people are necessarily like specialized in ventriloquism, but he says, "Oh yeah, I learned these ventriloquist tricks back in the blah 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 blah." So it's not just that he has these 5 trades that he surpassed his masters in. He has a bunch of different skills that he surpassed his masters in. There are 5 trades that he has people that work for him who are masters of that trade as well. and yet he's still better than them in their own specialization trades as well. He's a very interesting character in that way.
Yeah, and unlike Superman, who is bulletproof, he is not. But at the same time, because of his amazing abilities and the testament that he is probably the strongest man in the world, he is, for whatever you may take it for, he is the original Superman and the character that Superman was based off of. He had all of these intellectual abilities, and he had this wild education. He was a well-traveled, globe-trotting criminologist and hero. He had fought monsters in some of the books that would have given any man a difficult time. But then he comes into this story, and I don't know, how do we want to begin talking about the actual story here? Do we want to just discuss what Lamont Cranston does at the beginning?
Sure. I mean, our reviews usually go through things and spoil stuff, so let's not worry too much about that. But I would say, I mean, it's kind of, the story starts out with an interesting little fun thing happening. Basically, it's about, it's basically about a guy in Lamont Cranston's mansion going through and there's a clandestine radio transmission that he talks to some guy that he's working for on. There's questions about, is the shadow even real? And then basically he gets orders from this voice on the radio, and they tell him to specifically do. I'm trying to remember. So it's a very long book, surprisingly.
Lee Crease. You're talking about Lee Crease at the beginning of the story.
At the beginning of the story, that's right.
So Lamont Cranston is, interestingly enough, almost an equivalent to Bruce Wayne, where he's perceived as a bit of a playboy, and he's a traveling adventurer, somewhat of a dabbling man of the world. Not quite a criminologist like Doc Savage would be considered, but
right.
He's had his share of adventures, and he's close friends with Commissioner Weston of the police.
Right.
And through these acquaintances, he tends to have information about things that get leaked back to the Shadow, not necessarily Lamont Cranston's own doing. A distinction to be made here is that if you're familiar with the Shadow, the movie, or the radio show, Lamont Cranston is the Shadow. However, in the original books, the Shadow was this character that had invaded Lamont Cranston's life and kind of like had this deal with him where, okay, so I will take on your persona and you occasionally just go on some vacations or something, because the Shadow needed access to some funds and he needed a cover story for where he was at times.
Yeah.
And Lamont Cranston semi-unwillingly went along with this scheme. And the deal was that when he came back to his mansion, the Shadow would vacate and let him have his life back. But, they kind of had this sort of gentleman's agreement. And in this book, through the actions of the villain of the story, whose name is the funeral director, the Shadow gets a bad rap, and Lamont Cranston becomes suspicious that the Shadow is now blackmailing him. And so, not knowing who he could turn to in this situation, he gets together with one of his lawyers and decides to get an introduction to Doc Savage, who is probably the only person he could think of.
He goes to meet the police commissioner first.
Yeah.
And the police commissioner has been called away on urgent business. And so then he decides to go to visit this lawyer friend and go see if he can talk to Doc Savage instead.
Yeah. Yeah, so Doc Savage, the one man in the city that could probably help him with this problem, and this kind of pits these two characters against each other. We end up having Doc Savage immediately saying, okay, well, his crew was operating largely under the assumption that the Shadow was just kind of this myth of the underworld, which, very surprising that even as far as like the expert criminology team that Doc Savage has, even they weren't really in the mindset that the Shadow could be a real person. And now they have this evidence that he is, and so they're all in. They're going to figure out, they're going to get to the bottom of this problem, because it seems like whoever is blackmailing Lamont Cranston may also be responsible for all the heart attacks that have been happening to rich people around the city.
Right.
And thus they say, well, we have to put a stop to this. The dynamics in this story are all over the place. the Shadow is not super interested in clearing his own name so much as getting to the bottom of the mystery himself. So he doesn't really even try to convince anyone that it's not him. He's much happier with people thinking he's not even real to begin with.
Yeah.
So he immediately decides to try and solve the crime. He has to foil Doc Savage and his crew at several instances because they're interfering with his work. So he's never directly going against them. He's sort of just a thorn in their side in many ways. And at the same time,
it's very vague at the not vague, but it's difficult the way that it's written. I was not unsure whether the Shadow had gone bad guy or whether he was in cahoots with the funeral director or whether it was someone impersonating the Shadow. There were a lot of possibilities that the book leaves open early on. Because, if one person can come up with these psychic powers to, have these amazing abilities of stealth and disguise, it's possible that someone else might as well. And so there's a lot of... Early on in the book, I was very much questioning who was who, and whether there was, two Shadows maybe, or something like that. Because it seemed to me like it was at least possible from the way it was written.
Yeah, it's a lot like that.
Which is kind of cool. It left a lot of mystery open to kind of keep you turning pages to figure out what the heck is going to happen next, which it was a good incentive to keep reading, because it was like, well, wait, he just did this, but now he did this, and this doesn't seem to, is this the same guy? He seems like he's in two places at once almost, and yada yada yada. Doc Savage, is he going up against Doc Savage? Is he working on the case in a different direction and just trying to stay clear? Is it a different guy? It kept me guessing throughout most of the book.
Yeah, and the methods of the methods of detective work that are employed by both parties. So the book jumps perspective a lot. It goes from the Shadow to Doc Savage to a guy named George Clarendon to the agents of both Doc Savage and the Shadow at times.
Yes,
you get to see a lot of the grunt work taking place when the Shadow will give his minions missions, and
right.
Doc Savage will have his men posted to try and learn new information about whoever they're chasing after at the moment.
Yeah, it's separated up a lot into like the chapters are, even though it's a pretty long book, it's separated into even a larger number of chapters than you would expect from the length of the book. Like, I think there's 65 chapters, counting the epilogue as its own separate chapter. There's a lot of places, and I think even it happens sometimes mid-chapter, where the perspective of the narrator changes, and you end up, looking at things from a different direction, which also keeps you guessing as to how much of this is reliable for you as the reader.
Yeah, and the amount of detective work that's actually done makes the story, it kind of makes you wanting to know what's going to happen next at every page turn. The Shadow employs a light bulb. He plants a fake light bulb in the back of one of the cars of the people he's trying to track down, and it emits what? It wasn't infrared. It was black light.
Ultraviolet light.
Yeah, it was ultraviolet light. And so he's tailing them first in a car and then in a gyrocopter with special glasses to pick up the ultraviolet light and find out where this car is going.
Yeah.
He uses the same trick to find out where one of Doc Savage's hideouts is when they're kind of going back and forth, trying to figure out... Well, Doc Savage is trying to figure out who the Shadow is. The Shadow is just trying to keep Doc Savage off his tail. And Doc Savage has actually captured, in this story, one of the Shadow's assistants. And so the Shadow is trying to get him back. The Doc Savage himself, he has one of his minions try and tap the phone line to the studio where the Shadow broadcasts from every couple of days or so. They're trying to trace him back to some secret lair. And Doc Savage is the first person that I'm aware of outside of, I think there was a villain in the Shadow's history that actually discovered almost everything about the Shadow and nearly brought down his whole organization. But Doc Savage, if anyone could do it, he'd be the other one to do it, and he does in this story to quite an extensive degree. There's a lot of information handed back and forth between the agents of the Shadow. The Shadow is always making calls to Burbank, who I believe is a canonical character. Harry Vincent, I don't know if he was canonical to the books. I know he was in the radio show,
Mm-hmm.
if but for one episode. There was a Harry Vincent that Lamont Cranston helped out in one of those.
Yeah.
Some of the agents there's a lot of regular characters in the Shadow novels. I think when they the first couple novels don't have quite as many. As they progress, he acquires a lot of helping hands, many of whom have names that you might be familiar with if you read modern comics. Well before any of this was happening in Marvel Comics, the Shadow actually had one of his trackers was named Hawkeye.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there actually
In fact, we see Hawkeye's origin story in this book.
Do we? Did I miss that?
It's right at the end. It's what happens to Spotter.
Oh, it was Spotter. Okay. I was going to say, I think Spotter had something to do with Hawkeye at one point, but I guess, yeah, that makes sense, actually. Was that in the epilogue?
Yeah, that's the epilogue.
How did I miss that?
I don't know.
Whatever.
Hawkeye is literally the last word of the book.
Huh. I'm going to have to go back and read it again. Anyway, there's a lot of modern comics, or at least a lot of Marvel and DC stuff really came out of Doc Savage and the Shadow. The Shadow not only had a minion named Hawkeye, he also he went up against a group called The Hand, which, if you're a Marvel reader, I'm sure you're familiar with The Hand. And
if you're not a Marvel reader, you might have heard of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and their group that they fight called The Foot.
Yes,
which was a parody of The Hand.
Yeah. I never really knew that until it was just a while ago, like a year or so ago, where I was reading a bunch of stuff and I was like, I'd never noticed that they were called The Foot, and that it never occurred to me that Master Splinter would have been based off of Stick from Daredevil.
Yeah.
And when I read that, I was like, oh wow, so like the Teenage Mutant Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird and Kevin Eastman, they are prime examples of two people who took something that they based off of something that they really, really loved and made something great out of it.
Yeah.
Arguably something bigger than the thing they loved to begin with for at least a decade.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles still enjoy popularity, but oh my god, they were such a huge thing back when that first movie came out, especially.
A friend of mine, well, there was the cartoon show, which was, I think every kid around our age watched that cartoon show
religiously
in America, like every single one. But like actually, there was just recently released a new Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles brawling video game, like the old arcade game, and it is super fun.
Yeah, the one that was released about a year or two ago.
Yeah, I think so. A friend
Shredder's
of mine picked
Revenge
it up.
Or something. I don't know. It was something like that.
I don't remember the full title. I don't remember the subtitle of the game, but I just played through it with a friend of mine last week, and it was super fun.
Yeah, so I mean, Turtles still enjoys a huge popularity, and so this is just one of them writing things to keep in the back of your mind. If you've got something you want to write and you're like, oh, but this is based off of something I really, really love, as long as you're not using the characters and names and places of the exact thing that you like, basing an idea off of something you love is perfectly legitimate. I mean,
and it's also a really good way to find motivation.
Yes, because you might already be sitting there thinking like, oh, this would make a good story for this comic book that I read. And then it's like, well, why don't I write that story and just create my own character for it?
Yeah.
But
well, it was, it was very smooth going, writing my homage to At the Mountains of Madness. Far smoother and faster than, writing something that's not based off of something that I already kind of know the flow of,
Yeah, and I have tons of fun writing stuff that's based off of pretty much a ton of anime and Terry Pratchett books that I like. I mean, Batman himself, of course, is based off The Shadow. Yeah. And then, as already brought up, a lot of characters that appear in other comics, like The Hand, or, well, that's an organization, but there is a character in The Shadow whose name, I think it was the Gray Skull, who quite obviously would have been the equivalent to the Red Skull in Daredevil again.
Mm-hmm.
there's a character who I'm pretty certain the Harlequin from The Shadow was a combination of the characters that became the Joker, Clayface, and much later on, Harley Quinn.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If nothing else, but for the name. Like, they were taking so many things from The Shadow during the creation of Batman that, like, you literally had a guy that acted like the Joker in the Shadow stories and could mold his face like Clayface, and so there were two characters right there. And then years and years and years later, in the 90s, when they created Harley Quinn for the television animated series, you had to wonder, it's like, did they just take the name of the Harlequin and call it Harley Quinn? I mean, nothing based off the character in that sense, but you know, they're still pulling stuff from The Shadow
Harlequin
after
is
all
just
this
a
time.
word, so they may have
Yeah, I
gotten
mean,
some
it's like
inspiration from it or not, but it doesn't matter.
maybe not, but it's just funny to think that, wow, are they still after all this time just pulling stuff straight out of The Shadow?
Yeah, right.
And there was an episode of that show that was kind of an homage to The Shadow. It was an episode where Batman got to work with one of his childhood heroes, who was an actor in a show where he played a character that was a lot like the Shadow.
Okay.
And as Batman, he worked with him to actually solve a crime, the actor that played this character.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a lot of, like, if you go back and read old stuff enough, you see stuff repeated over and over and over again. Characters, themes, places and plots and story ideas that you shouldn't worry too much about whether or not you're copying someone. I mean, obviously you don't want to straight up... the original Batman comics straight up plagiarized The Shadow, almost word for word in many cases. You don't necessarily want to do that. But, like for instance, I had a thing that was based off of the Dirty Pair, but if you actually read it and then read Dirty Pair, you might see the similarities to the characters a little bit.
Yeah, I didn't. I mean, I didn't see the similarities until you mentioned it to me. So
yeah, they were based entirely off of those characters. I mean, Country Kitchen is supposed to be Yuri, and Milk Muffin is supposed to be Kay, and Colas is supposed to be Moogie. And I even kind of made a reference to Colas having the little ear things that he could twitch to control the ship, a la Moogie in controlling the Lovely Angel in Dirty Pair. So, yeah, sometimes it's a very thin reference, sometimes it's a very blatant reference, and even blatant references aren't really that big of a problem because you will see them everywhere if you read enough things. You start to see, oh, this was... How many characters are based off of the Monkey King from ancient Chinese literature at this point? You know, you've got Goku from Dragon Ball Z, you've got Sun from the Capcom games.
Yep.
There was a television show in Australia called Monkey that was based off of the legend, but was really just a weekly martial arts show. It's a lot of people that, you know, read entertainment and find something they enjoy, and eventually enough people see it where one of them decides to become an author too and make their own thing, and they're heavily inspired by the things they've read in the past. So getting back to the Shadow and Doc Savage, getting back to the Sinister Shadow,
yeah,
you do have a lot of detective work that takes place in this story, which was so refreshing compared to what was going on with DC at the time in terms of Batman, who is constantly referred to as the greatest detective in the world, and you never actually get to see him do much detective work. I think a lot of that lore was really cemented in the 90s animated show for Batman, where he did do a significant amount of detective work when he was solving crimes. But even there, this book kind of blows that out of the water. There is quite literally Sherlock Holmes levels of detective work going on, and on both parties' part. Doc Savage is able to go into a crime scene and find a clue that nobody else can find. Because of his special training, he has very sensitive touch, so he can run his hands over something like a piece of paper with writing where someone wrote on a piece of paper over it and feel the indentations and kind of guess what it might say. He's got a very good memory, so he's able to take a letter that the Shadow wrote at one point and memorize it. It's written in code, but because he has basically a photographic memory, he can write down the code and then translate it, even though it was written in ink that disappeared almost immediately.
Right.
He has a good grasp
he has a chemical lab that he can look at evidence with.
Yes.
Microscopes and that kind of stuff as well. There's a lot of neat technical details as well as like quote unquote special abilities. He uses a lot of neat tech. There's mentions made of a variety of different like actual criminology techniques and technologies that are a little bit exaggerated for the purposes of the story, but are based on real things that existed at the time.
Yeah. And then we already mentioned some of the Shadow's detective work, secret. He too uses a bit of technology, but his is not quite as extravagant because he has Lamont Cranston's budget to work with, but he has a lot less direct support because he has to maintain his secret identity. So even his agents don't really know who he is, even though many of them have met him on occasion. I mean, the Shadow, especially in this story, the Shadow is such a well-guarded character in terms of who he is that even after Doc Savage is able to fully unmask the Shadow and read his personal diaries and get a good look at him and have him captured at one point, he still knows nothing about the Shadow.
Yeah.
It's actually quite fantastic how everything comes together between the two of them. They are basically at odds throughout the entire book. Like most stories where it's one hero versus another, there is a brief moment where the two of them do work together, but it is way closer to the end of the story than is usually the case in these stories.
Yeah.
I think, like, take the Batman versus Superman movie again. I think it was halfway through, or maybe 3/4, they decided to work together, and it was over nonsense, whereas these two had been at each other for so long, Doc Savage and the Shadow, in this story, that a couple of small events happen that are the determining factors. And you might miss them as you read it. But, like, for instance, when Doc Savage finds out where the Shadow's hideout is, the Shadow actually has him dead to rights at one point. He knows someone's in the room with him. He uncovers the hiding place of Doc Savage, and he's got a gun pointed at Doc Savage's head. And he was straight up just going to fire, and he lifted his arm away, firing into the air instead. That's how close he was to putting a bullet in Savage.
Yeah.
And because he recognized who it was, and the Shadow isn't going to kill Doc Savage because he knows that Doc Savage is basically a criminologist like himself, someone who's putting away really bad people. But it's a much stranger alliance.
When you say putting away really bad people, we probably should take a couple minutes to talk about Doc Savage's
yes. I was actually
method of doing so.
I was actually rolling right into that.
Which is highly politically incorrect compared to today's compared to anything you'd see today.
He mind wipes them.
Well, I was going to use the word lobotomize.
Yeah, well, no,
yes.
it's better than lobotomize. By better, I mean worse. He actually erases any sense they have of their own personal history and who they were.
Yeah, well, he
lobotomizes
he says
them.
that it's brain surgery. So,
yeah.
like, it's a more advanced version of lobotomy.
Yeah, he will take hardened criminals, and instead of locking them away or putting them to death, he quote-unquote reforms them by performing surgery that makes them forget that they were criminals, makes them hate crime. He gives them a trade, teaches them to do something good for society, and releases them back into the wild.
Yeah.
And
he calls and it's funny, it's even funnier because he calls this institution that he has the college. Which actually might be pretty close to reality in this point. Yeah.
Well, yes, actually. And I think the word re-education does get dropped in the book at one point.
Yes.
I vaguely remember that actually being in there. But this is actually one of the points that kind of, like in a lot of the superhero crossover stories, the superheroes tend to come to terms because of something good. Well, in this case, the Shadow and Doc Savage determine that they should work together because, well, Doc Savage has uncovered the Shadow's identity and could essentially blackmail him. And the Shadow has uncovered the fact that Doc Savage is lobotomizing people and he could essentially blackmail him if he wanted to. So they're basically like, why don't we keep each other's secrets and get this criminal that has been plaguing us for this entire book?
Right.
Which even then Doc Savage finds a little trouble keeping the Shadow under control. He has to get him to agree to a truce that he won't shoot the bad guys, which is the biggest mistake that Doc Savage makes in the entire book. I kind of want to leave that one hanging because I want people to read it, and
Yeah,
the reason that that's so funny is at the end of the novel, and it's a great moment, probably my favorite moment in the book. But it's worth reading. It's a really fun book from start to finish. There's just so much going on. There's rich people dropping dead and super criminals working in the background, two heroes who aren't sure where to place each other, strange alliances that happen as a result of two superhuman characters duking it out. You have the Shadow who, rather than try and put a stop to Doc Savage and his crew, is just putting roadblocks in their way and misleading them so that he can get his own job done. And at the same time, Doc Savage's own little subterfuge against the Shadow, where he leads the Shadow into thinking one thing is happening, but in reality, the Shadow isn't aware that Doc Savage has uncovered as much about the criminal going-ons of the real bad guy. And so this actually leads to how they capture the Shadow. Like at one point, because Doc Savage had, without the Shadow realizing it, been able to tap or been able to find the frequency that the bad guys are broadcasting on, he's able to get information about where some of the Shadow's minions are being held who have been kidnapped. And so he plants a trap for the Shadow because he knows the Shadow will come to rescue them. It's fantastic little things like this. A lot of the action, there is so much action in this story. The Shadow plugs a bunch of bad guys in an alleyway. He drops his gyrocopter out of the sky with the engines turned off so he can do a silent infiltration.
Yeah.
He's constantly under fire from Doc Savage's men when he tries to invade their bases, or Doc Savage and his crew were being chased by the funeral directors' gangs at one point, and they escape an exploding car. They end up, the Shadow and Doc Savage have a building side battle where the Shadow is scaling the wall of a building and Doc Savage is rappelling down this wall trying to catch the Shadow, and they actually
blind.
Yes. The Shadow has the Shadow's technology is a bit weirder because he tends to keep the stuff that the super criminals that he put an end to were using. He has this machine that can muffle sound and create pitch black and turn off all electronic objects. And he uses this in a ploy in which he goes to visit Doc Savage, who he suspects already knows that he's using a secret identity, or he's using a cover identity. And he thinks that Doc Savage already knows this cover identity. So when he visits, he has a backup plan to escape, which ends up with them going down the side of a building and fighting on their way down, a la Battletoads or something.
Yeah, it's really quite an amazing scene to read, because there's just so much against Doc Savage, and yet still he continues to press forward and try to get hold of the Shadow, and it's just a really fun scene that's really memorable.
Yeah, and they're it's very much Doc Savage's character to do this. I mean, he essentially says, "Yep, this is dangerous, but I could catch the Shadow right now. I've got to risk it." And he leaps out a window with a cord, and of course, at one point the Shadow is cutting away at his cord with a saw and doing his evil shadow laugh the whole time. The laugh happens so much in this book. I think this might be the one book that has it more than any other book.
Uh-huh.
It just, the laugh is constant in this book, but it always seems to fit in like every situation that it's in. Maybe a little overdone, but I loved it every time. And this is of course where you learn a couple of things about both characters. Like Doc Savage actually does catch the Shadow on the way down this building, and the Shadow for the first time realizes he might be in a bit of trouble, because there's just a brief description of the Shadow realizing that he's having trouble breaking free of Doc Savage's grip. And at the same time, Doc Savage realizes, after the Shadow manages to cut his cord away, he takes a bit of a fall, but he falls on a ledge. And so for the first part of the book, he's really suspicious. Would the Shadow actually have killed him, or did he know that ledge was there? And he really starts leaning towards, no, he knew that. And this becomes more and more evident as time goes on, because both characters at one point or another in the novel, actually both of them at several points, have the other one dead to rights. and in both instances they both kind of turn the other way. Like at one point when Doc and Shadow have a bit of a scuffle, where Doc Savage finds out that was actually another great moment of education for Doc Savage. They have a fight in the Shadow's sanctum when Doc Savage first discovers where he is. After the Shadow pulls his gun away, Doc Savage and the Shadow start to tangle, fisticuffs and grappling, and Doc Savage is very surprised to find that the Shadow can actually keep up with him on a strength basis. Now, Doc Savage is much stronger than the Shadow, but just the fact that the Shadow can thwart some of his holds and can dive out of the way.
The fact that it's close is surprising, yeah.
Yeah, it's and the only reason that it really kind of ends is because Doc Savage has a few tricks up his sleeve, such as a knockout poison that is on a thing on the end of his thumb that he manages to clip the Shadow on the cheek with. Now, the Shadow's vulnerable to him at this point, and he could have captured him right then and there, but for reasons that are only Doc Savage's, he kind of just leaves the sanctum and goes back to his people and doesn't even mention that he had the Shadow captured. Even though later on they do actually capture the Shadow. It's one of those things where you kind of... I get the impression that was the point of the Shadow pulling his gun away and not shooting Doc Savage. Like
no,
having
I mean,
that scene...
Savage says I'm pretty sure that at some point a little later, Savage says, "Oh yeah, I knew that you weren't... I knew that I could not trust you, but I knew that you weren't, pure evil because of the way that you didn't shoot me when you had me down dead to rights."
Yeah, but that's much later, as opposed to just in that moment. That's the only clue that you have as to why Doc Savage would do that in that moment. Because I think that's at the end of the story.
Considering that you get a couple of paragraphs, or say a paragraph describing how the Shadow is like, "Oh crap, it's Doc Savage. I don't want to shoot him. I'm gonna, pull my hand away." You kind of get the feeling that Doc Savage probably picked up on that, and that changed his perspective on the Shadow. There's one thing that you mentioned a minute ago that I want to just get to before we move on, and that's the Shadow's laugh being so prevalent in the story. You've read this book several times. On my first reading, I was definitely not sure whether the Shadow really was the Shadow, or whether there were two of them, or whether there was an imposter, or whether there were multiple imposters. And so my impression, based on the prevalence of the laugh, is that it was being used, possibly, to convince people that someone who was the Shadow wasn't, or someone who wasn't the Shadow was the Shadow. You know what I mean?
Well, it was in a couple of points. I mean, there were parts where it was said that, after the laugh, it was like, well, that was the funeral director, clearly. And even Doc Savage impersonated the Shadow at one point. I don't remember if he did the laugh or not, but he did do the Shadow's voice while trying to trick one of the bad guys.
No, but it's just one of those things that you didn't mention that I think is important to mention. That might be why the laugh is so prevalent, is because there are multiple people who could be acting as the Shadow throughout the story.
Yeah, and actually, the first time I read through it, I was suspicious of what was really going on, too, because I still kind of had a lot of the lore mixed up in my head, like, which Shadow is this? Is this like the...
Well, so I've heard a lot more of the radio show than I've seen the books. And so I was going through, like, a good chunk of the book thinking that Lamont Cranston was actually the Shadow and was trying to create some kind of,
kind of illusion or feint.
Some confusion or illusion or that was going to be the reveal or something like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if that's where the story was going myself for the first quarter of it the first time I read it.
Right.
There was a lot to kind of absorb as the story went on, like, because the Shadow in the books, I'm trying to remember, I think his name was Kent Allard in the books, but that might have just been a comic book name. I read a comic recently where I think it was Kent Allard or Allard Kent or something like that.
Okay.
But anyway, the original Shadow was supposed to be, as far as I know, this like World War I spy who ended up becoming this criminal killing superhero. And they mention that it's actually Spotter in this book who mentions that there used to be this guy who everyone knew was once a spy in World War I, and if people tangled with him, it was not a good thing. And he said he caught a glimpse one time of the Shadow fighting a couple of guys, and he saw his mask, the bottom half of his coat slip down to where he could see the bottom of his face, and the damage to his face reminded him of that guy. And he says he was always convinced that the Shadow and that man were the same person.
Sure, sure.
Yeah, so
there's a lot of really neat like identity finagling that goes throughout the story that keeps you guessing. Especially when like there's so much action in the story that you never really get never really get downtime to like sit and really think about what you've been shown in the previous chapters.
Yeah.
There's always something happening that's keeping your attention. And so like all of these questions remain, unless you deliberately slow your pace in reading the book, all of these questions kind of never get answered. That is to say, you never really get to spend a lot of time thinking about possible answers to these questions until you see them in the book.
Yeah, and not a lot of them can really be divined. I mean,
Right.
it's a good mystery in the sense that it gives you the sense that you could be solving some of this as it goes along. But it's kind of like a Nero Wolfe mystery where eventually you're going to have it all at the end, and the clues are there, but you're not the one that's really supposed to put them together. You're just supposed to enjoy the ride.
There's also the fact that like a lot of the methods for interpreting the clues are based on like having some kind of well-stocked chemical laboratory or something like that, which is more of a Sherlock Holmes thing than a Nero Wolfe thing. But
yeah, but it's more like in Sherlock Holmes, you don't necessarily get a lot of the clues that could help you solve a mystery, whereas Nero Wolfe tends to get a lot of the clues that helps him solve the mystery. It's just that in both cases, you don't really know who's the culprit until the end, or whenever it's revealed by Nero Wolfe in his case.
Yeah.
I mean, Sherlock Holmes tends to go off the rails after you've been given all the clues. You still can't solve it because then they'll introduce a character who will have a 30-page monologue about why he did what he did, and that's how you figure out who the criminal is, and then Sherlock Holmes breaks everything down at the end, or right before that happens.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Doc Savage, he has people that do a lot of investigating for him, but he tends to be very hands-on. It seems
so there
like
are two he has these 5 guys that work for him that are all really good in their individual fields. In this book, throughout most of the book, only 2 of them are really active. The third one is captured, and so he can't really do anything for most of the book. Late in the book, he does a little bit, but throughout most of the book, we have Monk Mayfair and Long Tom.
Yeah,
I don't remember the rest of Long Tom's name, but Monk Mayfair is a chemist, and Long Tom is a electrical engineer. So there's a lot of cool aside points where those 2 are doing something interesting that also is it's kind of like a break from the constant Ray Peroling of Doc Savage.
he does Ray Peril pretty hard, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. And so it's really interesting to see these side characters get a pretty significant part in the story, and they're both unique, and they're both interesting. And they both have some good dialogue, so definitely worth paying attention to them.
Yeah, and the same is true of the Shadow's minions. Harry Vincent is he's called upon in several parts in the story, most notably to go to the Cranston mansion and protect Lamont Cranston's niece.
Right.
Because due to the criminal in this story, it's kind of funny. He's technically, by the standards of the time that this story would have been written, a super criminal, but if you'd really be pushing the bounds, because even the way the Shadow describes him, it's just like, this is someone I've tangled with twice. He managed to escape me twice, but for the most part, he's a criminal that's gotten a lot older and just wants to make his fortune and be done. And he doesn't want to tangle with me. But the fact that he decided to get involved with Lamont Cranston kind of led him back in my direction. And so I went after him
forced
again.
His hand.
Because the criminal in this story, the whole time, he's kind of like, I'm not so worried about Doc Savage so much, but the Shadow was a real threat to my organization. Like he doesn't really care about Doc Savage up until one point in the story where he actually defeats Doc Savage, but he doesn't kill him. He's got Doc Savage and Monk Mayfair at his mercy, and he says, you know what? If we kill these 2, the wrath of the police that will come down on us will be so great that it could be almost as big a threat as the Shadow. Let's just give them their minion back and hope that they leave us alone after this. And so they leave them there. They let them rescue. I forgot his name already. The other guy.
Ham, right?
Yeah, Ham. They let them rescue Ham, and to the funeral director, that's the end of it. It's like, whatever. Even if Doc Savage comes after us after this, probably not a big deal. He just wanted his man back.
Right.
But yeah, throughout the whole story, this guy he's kind of terrified of the Shadow while at the same time trying to issue ultimatums to the Shadow. And the Shadow is relentless. It's always been in his character that, you know, the weed of crime bears bitter fruit and crime does not pay. And the Shadow is the one that's going to make sure that crime does not pay by making them pay. He spends the entire book harassing and chasing down the funeral director at every turn, eliminating his gang one after the other after the other. I mean, at one point, the funeral director sends an entire squad of gunmen after him, and the Shadow just litters an alleyway with their bodies. Very, very unforgiving.
Yeah.
It's like if you cross the Shadow...
Like, it's worth noting that the Shadow just shoots regular guns, but the Doc Savage people have these crazy, like, high-tech machine guns that shoot non-lethal rounds. It's a very big difference. It's a very stark contrast between the two characters. Is that you have the Shadow, who literally just has, you know, a standard everyday automatic pistol or semi-automatic pistol that he's really good with, and he just shoots people. And then you have, you know, the Doc Savage people who have these machine guns that are described as firing an uninterrupted stream of what they call mercy bullets, which like it's not like you pull the trigger and like you pull the trigger rapidly and there's a bullet every, you know, a couple times a second. It's like they literally describe the bullet stream as like a flowing liquid in some of the scenes of the book. That's how fast these guns fire, and you know they have no recoil, and you know, and yet they're still non-lethal. It's kind of a little bit of a huge contrast between kind of the almost unbelievable technical expertise of the Doc Savage people versus I just shoot people simplicity of the Shadow.
Yeah, and Doc Savage comments several times throughout the story that when they're dealing with the Shadow, that they are dealing with one of the greatest masterminds to ever have lived.
Right.
So you do have this situation where, you know, Doc Savage is possessed of technology that, by the description of the book, he has computers that are probably a decade or two more advanced than what anyone else has in the world. And it's really weird how this dynamic works, where Doc Savage is this Superman, highly intellectual, highly trained, tons of technology and wealth at his disposal, and the cooperation of the police. He's an honorary police officer.
Right.
And the person that is giving him the most trouble is someone who has maybe half of that. Regular technology, if not basic technology, nothing but the psychological influence that he has on the criminal underworld, a few scattered bases that aren't actually property that he owns. And the Shadow gives Doc Savage a run for his money despite all of Doc Savage's resources.
Yeah.
It's like hunting terrorists in Afghanistan. It's crazy. Except this was a bit more fun.
Yeah.
I think as far as the technology goes, you see a couple of extravagant things that are a little crazy even by today's standards. I mean, there's the super machine guns that you mentioned. Doc Savage has some strange chemicals that he uses for a bunch of different situations. The funeral director inexplicably has a chemical that causes heart attacks that...
Well, it's not inexplicable at all. It's explained very well through the book, but yeah.
Well, it's explained later in the book when they talk about the brother of the person who Doc Savage used to learn from and how the funeral director took over his identity.
Right.
Kind of used his... So really briefly, a minor point, but this guy was trying to come up with more humane ways to kill criminals.
To execute criminals.
To execute criminals. And was probably murdered because he had discovered something that gave people heart attacks. And the funeral director used that technology to kill the rich people throughout the book that he was blackmailing. The plot of the criminal was essentially, hey you, I'm going to kill you if you don't give me money. And so give me money. And whoever didn't pay would mysteriously die of a heart attack.
Right.
This was what Doc Savage and the Shadow were up against. There's a lot of intuition in this story as well, because the Shadow receives one of the boxes that has a recording on it that basically tells him, hey, I know you're the Shadow, get lost, quit interfering with my business. And then it's this recording box, and the Shadow actually takes it apart after he finds it, and does his sinister laugh and puts it back together. Later on, Doc Savage gets a hold of that same box and discovers that if you play it a second time, it'll release a gas that'll kill you.
Right.
I don't know what I don't know if the funeral director's plan was to kill the Shadow by getting him to investigate it, but the Shadow was a bit too clever for that. His intuition was at peak there, where he's like, I'll take this thing apart piece by piece to see what's going on with it.
Yeah.
Whereas Doc Savage just has this incredible laboratory where even there they almost managed to get taken out by this gas before he was like, oh wait, maybe we should put this thing in one of our machines.
Yeah.
So
well, no, don't they hear it hiss and they jump into
a
safe
room? They
do.
They jump out of the way, then they put it into their machine to X-ray it or whatever they called it.
Yeah.
To give it an electrocardiogram. I don't know.
Well, no, I think they mentioned mass spectrometry at one point.
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
story,
they do.
Which is like, oh, cool, like that's a real thing.
But it had a weird name, like was it an electrospectrometer or something?
No. I mean, they say that too, but I think they say the phrase mass spectrometer at one point.
Yeah, they do.
There are some technology things that are like far fetched, but there's also the use of some things that are like real and were pretty high tech at the time.
Yeah, I think the most far-fetched thing is the let's make everything dark box that the Shadow has.
Yeah.
And, it's kind of brushed away as, oh, this is something a super criminal was using, and the Shadow just decided to keep it. So
right.
It's technology that we can just assume was the invention of some deranged genius that created something that even Doc Savage doesn't quite understand.
Sure.
But even then, they went to pains to try to explain like some of the properties of this device that was just a one-off. They talked about how the sound was kind of muffled and electricity was stifled by whatever this beam emitted from this box was doing.
Yeah, over a fairly wide area too.
Yeah, and it basically turned night to day, so it was kind of hinted that, or yeah, day to night. It was kind of hinted that it was blocking out the light from the sun in some ways due to the electrical properties.
Like my understanding was that it like made people blind in the same area for the same reason that it made electronics not work, kind of thing.
Is that? Oh, I must.
That was the impression that I got.
Okay, I interpreted it entirely backwards then.
Because there were people outside looking up at the area where the field was operating, and they could see the side of the building, I think.
No. There was a quote from someone who said, "Yeah, we look up and it's pitch black and nobody knows. It's like night fell."
Yeah, like over a limited area.
Yeah, but all in all, I mean, what were your impressions? Like, tell me about how you enjoyed the book.
Well, I mean, it definitely kept me turning pages. The mystery, the question of like whether this was actually the Shadow or whether it was someone impersonating the Shadow or whether there were two Shadows. It seemed like there was some overlap between some of the Shadow's henchmen with the funeral director's henchmen at first, and so like I was like, well, are they working together? Is one pretending to be the other? Is one hijacking the people of the other? And so there was a lot of like, wow, what is going on? I'm trying to figure out who's who and whether this is actually the Shadow or whether it's somebody else. Once Doc Savage got involved, there was a lot of cool science fiction and science fact stuff that happened that I found interesting. There was some cool intrigue where like Monk Mayfair went to like a bar to see if he could flush out one of either the Shadows or the funeral director's henchmen kind of thing. There was a lot of car chases. There was a lot of autogyros.
There was a hint of spy story, a hint of mystery story, a hint of action story. It covered a lot of ground.
A lot of action story.
Well, it covered a lot of ground, but not only did it do that, all of those things were like major elements of the story. It wasn't just like,
yeah.
I'll give you another hint that involves DC. When that latest Batman movie came out, where it was it was the Riddler, and I remember a lot of people saw the movie and were like, oh yeah, this is Batman actually being a detective in the story. And I went and watched it, and it was like, every time he's around, less detective work is getting done. He's literally doing zero detective work in this story. it wasn't quite as bad as that Liam Neeson Philip Marlowe movie, but
Yeah.
Batman didn't really do much detective work in that movie. He was just kind of hanging around crime scenes. like some kind of criminology hooker. And and compared to this book, where almost every chapter has Doc Savage questioning some element of a clue and trying to determine where it can lead him, and following that lead to its next logical point. And the same is happening with the Shadow throughout the whole book. I mean, this book contained, in some ways, more mystery than a lot of mystery stories I've read. Even if it wasn't
I would say
quite...
that's not. I would say that's pretty a reasonable thing to say. There was a lot of different things that had me questioning. Okay, how is this going to play out? There was a lot of like, okay, this is what they're telling us, but it seems like this might conflict with something they told us earlier. Which one do we believe? We've got this thing that just happened. Has anyone prepared for this beforehand? Maybe we'll find out next. Maybe someone did swap out a light bulb with an ultraviolet one. Who knows? There were a lot of neat tricks. There was a lot of neat, just that relentless plotting forward of the story of like this happening, then this happening, then this happening, and constant changes of perspective really kept me on my toes as a reader.
And the mystery aspect too. The characters, they all followed really logical steps in their next move.
Yeah.
From one part of the mystery to the other, and there was enough happenstance that because you do kind of want some happenstance in a mystery story once in a while.
A little bit.
Obviously, you want the mystery to be something that it seems like these people would actually be able to solve. But every once in a while, happenstance is a good thing too. And in this story, the happenstance that happened...
Well, I mean, the thing about happenstance in a story like this, right, is we have this character, Doc Savage, who has all this crazy high tech, right?
Yeah.
And so, in theory, if the writer wanted to write it in this way, he could. He could just say, oh yeah, we did this, we processed it, and we got this information, we went to the next place. But that would get very repetitive over time because, realistically, the details of whether it was a mass spectrometer or an electro, blah, 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 whatever, don't really matter to the reader so much because they're just buzzwords that the author is using. By switching it up every so often and having them get something through intuition or, just get something by a little hair of luck, or even bad luck turning good is a good way to change that pacing and keep it fresh, right?
Yeah.
Because like for this clue, Doc Savage analyzed it and they figured out something and they followed the lead. For this clue, they thought it was this, they were wrong, but because they were wrong, they did this, and this led them to doing this other thing, which led them in a different direction, which ended up being helpful in some way. There's a lot of that.
Yeah, it didn't feel like the characters were just in a big bowl of soup being stirred everywhere.
Right.
Even the moments where there was a lot of happenstance, you never had the impression that nobody was really unaware of what was going on. Like Doc Savage and the Shadow both would have multiple agents posted in places where they thought they might be able to come up with some lead. And so even if it was happenstance, they were prepared for when a happenstance would occur.
Yeah. And there were times where Doc Savage was not the hands-on person, where like Monk or Long Tom were. And those were also interesting changes of pace too, because you got to see how these other characters who are... See, the thing about Doc Savage is that everyone knows who he is. He's super famous. And so one of the strengths of his of his henchmen, so to speak, is that they're not famous. And because they're not famous, they can do things that Doc Savage couldn't do without being recognized. And so that's another way to change up how things are paced and how things are flowing by, changing from characters from a character like Doc Savage who, it has a lot of technological expertise and a lot of interesting skills, but really can't do stealth, right? Like, he's just too well known to do stealth.
Yeah.
And you can switch over to someone else on his team who has the expertise that is needed for the thing that he would want to do there, but also has the ability to get in and get out via stealth or subterfuge, where Doc Savage wouldn't be able to do that. Like Long Tom infiltrating the radio station. Like,
Oh
that
yeah,
was a really fun couple of chapters.
it was great because his whole plan consisted of, I need to get this job and be working here so I can flip a circuit breaker and turn off lights and then go look down a hallway.
Right.
but the
And
setup for that,
it was like super overblown for what he wanted to do, but like at the same time there was a lot of really fun like dialogue between him and his boss. Like he's like, "Oh man, I hear that shadow records from here." And he's like pretending to be, subtle but totally failing at it. And the boss is like, "Yeah, nobody's supposed to go over there." What? What if I went and took a peek? He's like, "Oh, that's a firing offense." He's like, "Oh, I guess I won't do it then." And of course he does it later, but like the whole point is that he's playing this character of like this this down on his luck, depression era electrical engineer who just needs a job, only to leave the job comically later on.
yes, it was actually it was a great way to leave the job.
Yeah.
When that scene happens, what's really great about it isn't necessarily the way. I mean, the way he's acting is great, but the great thing about it is that he's on a mission to try and discover something about someone who is probably much more clever than he is.
Uh-huh.
And it's almost impossible. The thing about the way he acted is that he literally can't make any mistakes here. He has to play it straight because he does not know who or where anyone will be watching from.
Right.
He doesn't know if any of the people that are there are involved with the shadow. He doesn't know if the shadow himself has any eyes on the building. And so he literally cannot make a mistake in doing this, because even a single mistake in his own head will be like, I might have to abandon mission because the shadow might already be onto me now that I've done this, and I could be putting Doc Savage in danger by giving him this information now.
Right.
So he has to play the role perfectly, and you get a sense of that as he's going through this scene. Where like the most dangerous thing he does is, to even bring up the shadow, and he kind of has to play it like he imagines anyone else would, like, oh yeah, I've heard that radio show, or yeah, they say a lot about that guy, just he has to talk about him as though he's just a normal person on the street that is in a conversation about the shadow.
Right.
There's a lot of, I mean, the spy story aspect of this story is also really great.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't know, I don't know too many stories that really captured all these different things as well as this. I would say that if I wanted to make a comparison to another story besides constantly trotting this one out before Batman versus Superman, there's another story I think has equal merit to this book that is also a similar idea, and it actually takes it one step further, whereas this is a story about two heroes that go toe-to-toe, and they form a really loose truce in the book towards the end that is on a much different basis than the normal hero crossover truce would be. But there's another book where it's just straight up two characters pitted against each other. And I guess you can't really call it hero versus hero, because one of them is, while heroic in many of his stories, he's not really a hero. And that's Sherlock Holmes versus Arsène Lupin.
Yeah.
Which, they never really form any truce in this book. This is a straight up battle between two great minds, and the events that unfold are there to make you, root for one over the other. But the book is kind of set up in the same way, where Arsène Lupin and Sherlock Holmes. So Arsène Lupin is France's great thief, for anyone who doesn't know. He's a character that was created and written about during the same era. He was contemporary with Sherlock Holmes. And the author of Arsène Lupin was Maurice Leblanc, who, he kind of ragged on the Sherlock Holmes character a lot in his stories. He would have Lupin say things like, "Oh, are you going to investigate the ashes of this cigarette tray to see what you can learn from it?" Whereas Sherlock Holmes would have this massive encyclopedic knowledge of things that he would need to solve crimes. Arsène Lupin was a character that did everything by intense planning and intuition. And Maurice Leblanc wrote this story where an obvious Sherlock Holmes character, whom he named Holmlock Shears,
Right.
who was assisted by the unspeakable Wilson. He finally decides to take a visit to France, and he's going to capture Sherlock Holmes. The story is
Arsène Lupin.
Arsène Lupin. Sherlock Holmes is going to catch Arsène Lupin. Basically,
That's his plan.
he gets
That's what he wants to do.
Yeah, he gets a letter from someone who's like, "Hey, this is a thing that happened, and it's Arsène Lupin. You're the only person that I think can capture him." And right out of the gate in that story, the battle is just another one, kind of like in this book, where it's the Shadow and Doc Savage. Lots of subterfuge between the two of them to try and catch the other out.
Yeah.
But right out of the gate in that story, you have a character in the story that is supposed to be Maurice LeBlanc, I'm pretty sure. Like, I'm not 100% sure on this, but there's a character in the Arsène Lupin stories who kind of talks in first person and narrates the story and says that, I'm basically Lupin's biographer. And in a couple of the stories, he has a physical presence rather than just telling the story. So in this story, Lupin is at a table talking with this character. And he talks about how Sherlock Holmes is coming to France, and he says, "This is going to be the greatest battle of my life, and I can't wait to give him the runaround, but it's also the most dangerous battle I'll ever face." And the guy's like, "Well, you don't look worried." And he's like, "Well, I mean, there are things to worry about, but I'm Lupin. This is what I do. I have to take on this big challenge." And then at that moment, Sherlock Holmes walks into the room. Now Lupin had already conveyed his thoughts on Sherlock Holmes to this character. He said, there was a short story before this where they both met each other briefly.
Yeah.
And he says, "I met him one time, just in passing, in the street. But the way he looked at me, I felt that he looked at me for life. Like he could see through anything that I was." And sure enough...
And well, it's worth noting that one of the things that Lupin uses a lot are disguises.
Yes.
So
yes.
This is especially meaningful coming from him as like, my usual MO might not work against this guy.
Right. And so this becomes a very cat and mouse, Lupin has to stay hidden kind of story. But Sherlock Holmes shows up. He does immediately recognize him. And he approaches the table with Lupin, and they have this conversation that's kind of like a gentleman's greeting, but the entire time Wilson is also there, like, "But that's him. Why don't we just catch him now?" And Sherlock Holmes says, "Well, you can see he's on the other side of the table. He has a reputation for being able to get out of really tight circumstances. He would probably be out of here before we could do anything." Lupin stands up, steps around to the other side of the table, offers his chair to Sherlock Holmes, and sits down. So he basically, in that moment, takes the glove off.
Yeah.
And so Sherlock and Wilson sit at the table with Holmes and character X, the biographer.
Yeah.
And they have a brief conversation in which Sherlock Holmes says quite confidently, "I will catch you in 10 days. And Sherlock Holmes, or Lupin says, "Well, I have a lot of work to do then. This is going to be a very difficult challenge for me, so I'll leave you to your preparations." And he gets up, takes a bow, and walks out. That is the character of Arsène Lupin in pretty much every story he's ever been in. He won't back down from a challenge very often. He will make these bold gestures confidently as ever, even in the face of someone like Sherlock Holmes. And then the story from there just unfolds in these differing... Sherlock Holmes follows lead after lead after lead, trying to get to the heart of like 3 different mysteries that Lupin has placed before him, so that he can ultimately figure out where Lupin is going to be, how he can capture him, and how he managed to perform several of the crimes that he committed. And the entire time, Lupin is setting trap after trap for Sherlock Holmes. At one point, he actually gets Holmes and Wilson to nearly knock each other out in a fist fight by having them think that the other is Lupin.
Right.
He's forever foiling their plans by misleading them. And even though a lot of the book is just Maurice LeBlanc making fun of the character of Sherlock Holmes, Holmes does have his moments in the story that make it a worthwhile adventure between the two of them. Even to the point where towards the end, it's like, wait, is Lupin going to get out of this?
Right.
It's one of the most fantastic reads under my belt. Kind of like this book. I would say that I really like the character of the Shadow. As far as a mystery book goes, it's called The Blonde Lady. That's Sherlock Holmes versus Arsène Lupin. And it's one of my favorite mystery books just because of the confrontation factor. And the fact that this isn't one of those books where the characters ever meet some kind of truce. They're always after each other. Very similar in style to this because there's constant action in that book. I would say the action is better written in The Sinister Shadow, and the story is more straightforward.
Yeah.
But, these are two books that I'm going to recommend right here and now, and really any Arsène Lupin I would recommend.
I think you can never really go wrong reading an Arsène Lupin book. You just can't.
Yeah. So
they're just so good.
So I know I got a bit sidetracked there, but I just kind of want to run the point home that there is just so much happening in this story. It's, there's mystery elements and all the action, and the characters are great, and they do have very defined characters for what you're given.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You can jump into this book without knowing anything about Doc Savage or the Shadow. You will understand who they are very quickly as the story progresses.
Well, kind of, sort of, because if you have a little bit of background with the Shadow, you will be asking questions about who is this actually the Shadow throughout the first 2/3 of the book. So
yeah, but you'll still understand the character of who it is. The real tricky part.
The question is this someone trying to be the Shadow, or is this actually the Shadow himself? In which case, could it be that this actor, imposter trying to play the part of the Shadow is making a mistake somewhere, kind of thing? Like there was a lot of that as I read it for the first time.
Yeah, I definitely felt the same way the first time I read it. So we might have just spoiled that for a couple people, but it's okay.
Well, I mean, if you actually sit and read the book, you'll see that it is actually pretty questionable, and there's enough leeway that it could be, some of the, there's definitely some places where it could be that there was someone impersonating the Shadow, although later on you'll start to see more and more of his signature techniques, and that'll start to cement when it's actually the Shadow versus when it might not be ?
Yeah.
It's interesting to read. It's worth a read even if you like I feel like we haven't said enough that a person will still be able to completely avoid being confused by the Shadow's appearances early in the story. And I think they're worth being confused about if you just read them as they come along and try to figure out what the heck is going on.
It really makes the story what it is. The mystery of the Shadow is in ways more entertaining than the mystery of the funeral director in this story. I mean, as you mentioned before, there's a lot of scenes in the book where, if we're going to attribute superpowers to anyone, it would be the Shadow. He has the uncanny ability to even slip into the back of a car and then slip back out unnoticed.
Right.
I read that part and I was thinking to myself, these are mental exercises that I used to do just because I used to do the whole ninja thing. And I'm thinking, how would you, if you were in the back of a car and you needed to get out unnoticed, can you actually shift and open a door handle quietly enough to do this, especially in an older car like they would have been driving in the 1930s? And then it's like, okay, so you would have to maybe wait until a bump in the road to move the handle, and you'd have to slowly be getting into the position to get it right. But then there's also, how do you close the door once you're out without anyone?
No, you'd have to wait for a moment where the car wasn't moving or something like that to avoid wind noises and stuff like that. But it's also worth noting that old cars like this often had very
clunky mechanical parts.
No. The exact opposite. They were actually very well crafted, and they had wood interiors and actual soft, not carpeted, but upholstered interiors that are totally beyond what we would expect today.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
Sometimes they would have tuned exhaust systems that would make them practically silent. My dad's a big fan of the Packard Car Company, and so I've been to a bunch of Packard car shows with him. And one of the interesting things about these cars is that even though they're these giant V12, not V12, but they're V12. They're V12 engines, some of them.
Some of them are 16-cylinder.
I don't know if there were any Packard 16s.
Oh, maybe not Packard,
I'm pretty sure Packard stopped at 12. But but like they had their exhaust systems tuned so that you could not hear the engine, despite the fact that it was a gigantic, huge displacement V12 engine. At normal speed, like he's told me stories in particular about how he would like walk up to one of these cars and like be looking at it, and then it would like pull away from him, and he's like, "Oh, it was running."
That's funny.
And like the loudest sound that you hear is like the tires crunching the gravel as it starts to move, kind of thing. So like, yeah, I mean, actually, back in the day, there was often. I mean, maybe not in the cheap cars, but like in some of the cars that they maybe were driving in the movie, you might have not movie in the book, you might have expected them to have fairly, handmade interiors where everything kind of fit together and didn't make too much noise. So yeah, it's certainly believable. Although it's far-fetched but believable. It's good in that way.
Oh, there's also a lot of times where the shadow is described as a blotch of shade.
That's what leads me. That's what leads me to think that he might still be having, like these psychic power kind of things going on, because it's not just that he like turns into a shadow. He turns into other people, like in the view of the narrator, which either means that the narrator is unreliable or that the narrator is describing the perspective of one of the characters viewing him. Either way, you either have an unreliable narrator, which would mean that a lot of these things might not be happening exactly the way you're hearing them, or you have this character that's watching this thing happen in front of his eyes, and he's being deceived in some way, and it might be some kind of mental, quote unquote psychic ability of the shadow that's just not described in that language in the book.
Yeah. Well, it has so many elements that make the entire story mysterious, including mystery elements, like logical mystery, a little hint of what could be viewed as supernatural.
Yeah.
The mystique of the shadow himself.
Right.
There's so much to draw someone into this story, and I feel like not enough people have read it, but it's one of the most worthy reads I can think of off the top of my head. I did not expect it to be anywhere near as good as it was when I first bought it, and I read through it, and I'm just like, I don't see any way that, like, I think it might be the best superhero crossover I know of.
Uh-huh.
I really can't think of a better one off the top of my head.
No, I mean, I'm not an expert in that field, so,
I'm not either,
I
but
can't think of any clear counterexamples.
I mean, there's some that obviously wouldn't count. I mean, the Marvel Universe has so many of the characters crossing over and doing things with each other that it really wouldn't count there. And then there's the Justice League in DC, but sometimes they actually do pick one that it's like, yeah, we're facing off Batman against Superman, and this is something that shouldn't happen, but does.
Yeah, right.
And even in the cases like that, like where it was something really special, something that like fans of it might have actually wanted, nothing comes close to this book. This book is my.
Well, it's very surprising that the book kind of languished in non-published obscurity for so long as it did.
Well, I mean, I think part of it might have been because the guy died before he put it together. Yeah. Another thing might just be because so many of the books, both Doc Savage and The Shadow, were so good. It's possible that this could be one of the weaker ones, for all I know, because I haven't read all that many of them.
Right.
That definitely gives me something to look forward to. I mean, I would love to think that this is like the weakest of all the Doc Savage and Shadow books, because that just means I have great books ahead of me.
You have like 250 really, really good books to go through.
Yeah, and that's just Doc Savage. There's like 300 Shadow novels.
Yeah.
I've never read any of the Destroyer novels, so who knows how good those are either, but I've heard a lot of people say good things about those too.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never heard about... I mean, like, they didn't call Remo Williams the Destroyer in the movie.
No, they didn't. But they do call the Destroyer Remo Williams in the book.
Right. Yeah, I had no idea that there was a significant series of books. I figured maybe it was like a one-off that someone was like, hey, let's turn this book or this comic into a movie, and then they did, and then there was nothing after that.
They tried to make a television series out of it too. I don't think it really got past a couple of episodes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I didn't know about the books either. I just happened across them one day. I was looking something up about Remo Williams, and that's how I came across, and I was like, oh, these are books. I need to look into these.
Yeah. All right.
I would say we unraveled some of the mystery of the Sinister Shadow today.
A little bit. You know, I think that we haven't gone whole hog spoilers like we would with something we hated, you know.
But people need to read this. That's why. I
think you should. I think it's worth reading even if you've heard our whole thing with the few spoilers that are in it, because it's just one thing that just final note is that I mentioned earlier that I just finished reading Triplanetary, and Triplanetary was written around the same time as the original manuscript for the book that eventually became this book. And it's worth noting that, and it may be partly because of the modern author taking a look at it and editing it appropriately, but like the language in this book is much more accessible than a lot of works you'll find that, you know, have their origins in the 30s and 40s. So it's just it's really well written. It's got a lot of really cool scenes, a lot of really colorful, interesting characters. It's got a lot of mysteries that'll keep you guessing. It's just a really solid book, and you know, if you want an introduction to the Shadow and Doc Savage, as I've kind of been hoping for myself, well, putting them together into one book saves you some time to get that introduction. So go for it.
Yeah, it'd be a good place to start. And I mean, if you don't want more after reading this, you're probably not a big fan.
Yeah, and that's fine too, even though you're wrong.
Yeah, even though you're wrong.
All right. Well, I think we'll call this an episode then.
I think we will. I think that it's just important to remember that the weed of crime bears bitter fruit.
Indeed.
Crime does not pay. So. The Shadow knows.
Thanks for listening to the Wordy Pair Podcast. Our passion is all things writing, world building, and getting into the weird and wonderful world of fiction. We hope you enjoyed our unique takes. If you did, make sure to like, rate, review, and subscribe to get your weekly dose of writing weirdness. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, hit us up on Twitter. For Rudy, it's @Rudolph_Cone. And for Justin, @Ninja Mouse Chew. See you next time on the Wordy Pair Podcast.